Hey, I'm Mary Claire, and welcome to Peak, the official podcast of Grow Sport. And today we are welcoming back Dr. Brian to continue our conversation. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks. Good to be here. Excited.
All right. Well, last week we had a quick discussion on the arch, so to speak. It's the foundational structure behind the sport model.
Right.
This week, I wanted to dive a little deeper into, we discussed the why, the what, and the how in terms of the arch. And let's start to pick that apart a little bit more and really talk about the why. So I'm going to pull the arch back up briefly,
Okay.
and then we're going to cover the mission, vision, values, and objectives that we touched on last week.
Fantastic.
Okay, Brian, so we got our arch back up here. Again, we last week kind of did an overview of the arch itself and the role it plays. Let's dive deeper into the foundational elements here of the why for our listeners.
Yeah, it's increasingly well known, Mary Claire, that great organizational culture really starts with why. And a number of other people have identified this, maybe most famously Simon Sinek, but others who have said, the real issue here is if you guys can figure out why you're doing what you're doing, it creates a whole foundation upon which you can build the rest of your strategic structure. So as we mentioned last time, the most important stones in an arch are your foundation stones and your keystone. And, we're going to talk about the keystone later and because it's got a very, very important role. But if you don't get your foundation right, then the rest of it isn't going to really matter and it'll end up crumbling anyway. And by the way, we see this in organizations where they spend a lot of time on strategy, but it never really sticks. It never really goes anywhere because they've not taken the time to really get the base down, the why. So if you start, first of all, with mission, the mission is really why the organization exists. What is its purpose? Why did we create it? What was it meant to do? The really interesting thing about the why components of the arch is that if you get them right, it will tell you what not to do.
Yep. That's a little hidden dirty secret.
Exactly right. And, focus is so important and yet so hard. And if we get the focus right, then we tend to actually get the outcomes that we're looking for. But so often, all these good things come along and we have a very hard time distinguishing between good, better, and best.
Yeah.
And if we could get the best and a real focus, then we get the outcomes that are most important to us. So if we start with mission is the why of the organization. We can start to think about the purposes and reasons for the formation of that organization.
Okay, so I think people often confuse mission and vision, and we can talk about the role they play. We're already getting at it, but one thing I wanted to note that we often tell our clients is that the mission and vision are they're actually for internal use case or for internal use. They're actually decision-making tools. I've got a client right now that's looking for a decision-making framework because they're easily getting distracted again, but why determining the good, better, best. And as a leader myself, I can tell you for sure, I did not use our mission and vision. I did use our values, but did not use our mission and vision as a decision-making tool when trying to make the best right decision for the organization. But in that, Brian, people often confuse the role or what is a mission versus a vision. I feel like there's a lack of clarity out in the market. So if the mission is the why, kind of what gets us out of bed, the purpose we have in this world, what is the vision?
Yeah, I appreciate you separating those two and really drawing a distinguishing line between them. It is so often we see companies and organizations that say, oh, here's our mission and it's really a vision, or here's our vision and it's really a mission. And I also love that you brought out that these are decision-making tools. They help define what it is we do and don't do. A vision, unlike a mission, is the state of the organization in the future. I mean, it's really what the word says. It's a vision. It's what we see out in front of us as we're headed down the road. So if the mission is the why we exist, the vision is the what are we going to become down the road? What will we transform into if we do everything that we started out to do right? I'll do this from a nonprofit situation. If you said, hey, we exist to distribute food to the poor and the hungry. Well, what would our organization look like if we were successful down the road? So the mission is to distribute the food to the poor and the hungry. The vision would be, what does that look like? Well, we're going to provide meals for hundreds of thousands of people in this region of the world, or we'll be the largest provider of food and clothing in this space in the next 3 years. Whatever it is that we want to do, we can identify, we can say that's what we are going to become, is our vision.
And I think when I think from an employee perspective, it helps me as an employee get a vision for, get an ideal for. Somebody paints a picture to me of what we're headed towards, what we want to look like. And the idea of we're going to paint a picture for everybody else that's not in this conversation right now, again, that it continues to keep us focused on what should we or should we not do. I think, again, as an internal decision-making tool is really vital.
And we could use maybe an example that will really resonate with everybody. If you said, hey, my mission in this life is to live a long and happy and healthy life. Okay, that's what I'm here to do. And then you say, all right, well, what's the vision? Well, I have a vision that in the next 3 to 5 years, I'm going to be like this vision of health. I'm going to be, slender, and I'm going to be strong, and I'm going to be healthy. And I can see this vision of myself in terms of what I look like and how I act and how I behave. Because then the next things that follow on from that are natural. So you can see the difference between kind of what I'm setting out to accomplish as my mission and what that's going to look like down the road, which is the vision.
Okay, so then we have values, and I feel like values, people put a lot of effort, or organizations put a lot of effort into values, and then it's hit or miss on how it's used in a decision-making mindset. I think it can often be used in good organizations from a hiring perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, I'd be curious how often it's used from a decision-making framework, deciding do we do or do we not do, good, better, best. So talk to us about values.
Values are interesting because you have formal values and you also have informal values. And we're going to choose a few formal values that we're going to kind of call out and really focus on. And by the way, they can be aspirational. Sometimes I get critique and pushback where an organization will be like, well, we threw up a value, but we don't really live it. And I said, well, that's okay if it's what you want to live and it's what you're aspiring to live.
Yeah.
What you really wanted to do is help direct your behavior. So if, for example, you said, hey, one of our values is transparency, and one of our values is to take care of our employees. Those are two, oftentimes those will come up. Well, it turns out that most of these values will at some point in time come in conflict with each other. So, for example, what if you have to be transparent, but that hurts the employee? Which is more important? Is it more important to be transparent, or is it more important to kind of protect the employee from, the kind of information that you might get? Now, you might argue that in the long run, transparency is always in the best interest of the employee. But these are the kinds of things you have to wrestle with, you have to grapple with respect to these values. If you had a value of being profitable and a value of being and having integrity, those two are going to come into conflict at some point in time. There's going to be an opportunity for you to generate profit in a way that probably isn't of the highest integrity. And then what is most important will win at that point in time. So values are a way to kind of make sure that we have a hierarchy of decision making available to us as a framework to help us make the right decisions at the right time. Now, again, you might have informal values as well that you also think are important that you want to apply, which is fine. But again, goes to your earlier point that these are really not about what you're putting on the wall for others to see, but what you're utilizing in your day-to-day as your decision-making framework.
And I think you've often said to clients, like, it's the rules of the game, so to speak.
Right.
It's how we play.
Yeah.
Which I think is another helpful way to think about how does it apply to the day-to-day. Okay. Objectives, I feel like, is the next step to like where the rubber hits the road here. We're getting more specific. We're getting more focused. Talk to us about objectives and their role in an organization.
Yeah, and the objectives are really kind of taking your vision one step further, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of bringing them into a little more focus. If you said, "Hey, my objective now is to, be, is to be of a healthy weight and to eat well and to sleep well," going back to our example about kind of long life and health. They're not. We've not gone so far as to put them in a goal form. But we kind of know where we're headed and what we're trying to accomplish. And so that vision that we've stated in a very amorphous form is now we're starting to put some meat on those bones, and we're starting to kind of flesh that out a little bit more so that we know exactly what we're trying to accomplish. And usually a good objective is a 2 to 5 year accomplishment and what you're going after in that period of time. Some industries move a lot faster than others, and so you can kind of play with that a little bit. But it's if we look back in some period of time, what do we want to have accomplished? So think about the vision as what do we want to have become, and the objectives of what do we want to have accomplished. Now, people might say, well, that's splitting hairs. There's a lot of overlap. Yes, admittedly, but they're a little bit different in the sense of the outcomes as opposed to the end product, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think it's, again, at least from having done this or having used this model as in the hot seat, so to speak, it is, for our team at least, it was one more level by which to make focusing decisions. So we know our vision, but there are 15 different paths we could take.
Right.
We're going to narrow those down to 3 and then get really specific about how we're going to attack those. So it is, while there is a very clear and almost super close connection with the vision, it is an exercise, one step further, an exercise in focus, super vital in creating a foundational structure around key strategies. So,
it's interesting too, Mary Claire, because a lot of times an organization will stop here at the objective level and call them goals and call them the what, when in fact you haven't gotten there yet. Right. So this is a great foundation for the rest of the strategic structure you're going to build, but it's not the end of that. So I just want to draw that out, that just because you've gotten to the objectives you're going after, that's not sufficient to getting you there.
Well, that's going to be a nice segue into our next conversation, Brian, on goals. So thanks for joining us today, Brian. Looking forward to the next conversation and diving deeper here into the Arch. For all those that are listening, hope you enjoyed this quick tidbit, quick teaching from Dr. Brian Ritchie. Please follow us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, we hope your drive toward peak performance is successful. Take care.